Hi, in this video lecture I want to try to bring together a few different concepts hopefully you've been able to pick up or kind of think about in the readings that you've done so far in this research category about poverty and injustice. Um, I might, say just if you're struggling a little bit with this kind of category, that shouldn't be too surprising. If, for example, you were to do a little bit more research on maybe if you just Google the Poor People's Campaign um, and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Towards the end of his life, um, where he had kind of started making the connections between the war in Vietnam, the political system, and how those two things contributed to poverty, if not caused them outright. Um, and he had a conversation with then President Lyndon Johnson about this, and that greatly influenced the concept of the Great Society and a lot of the social programs that came out of that. So it's tough because we're not looking at poverty as like I'm poor um, and there's some way I can get out of it. We're looking at poverty more as a population of people um, that both many people in the government and certainly people in the private sector of banking intend to be poor. And if that group of people were not poor, then there'd be a lot of problems in the economic sector as far as wages that would rise, and then it would be very difficult to move capital investments around. And so there is a requirement in banking, which at the moment people are calling reserves, right? And so you can think about that. You need a certain number of people to also be in reserves, not just currency. Um, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about this because it is a very complicated subject. And so oftentimes we talk about it in class, it's a little bit easier because we have examples to follow. Um, the second part of that is that what makes this super complicated is that there's a lot of vocabulary. And I'm sure you picked that up, especially in the politics of land reform, and also in the reading that Bell Hooks wrote about how we don't really talk about poverty or class in the classroom. And I think there's two reasons for that in my own experience, coming from either lower middle class, working class, or many times poor, growing up, versus a lot of my colleagues, have never experienced that. And I think that's kind of, self-evident in a way, or common sense if you think about like who can afford to go to college. And myself, I took out student loans, right, to be able to do that. And very few people I knew growing up were able to go to college. So I think, there's always this issue of who's in the classroom teaching, right? What is their experience? And then now I'm adding this layer of law. And so to try to think about this, I've tried to give you both fiction and nonfiction readings so you can kind of have a bigger context, right? So you can think about it beyond just our own personal experience and try to think of it in some kind of a system. So when we think about a system, the first system that we really have to confront is slavery. And so there are ways of thinking about slavery, right? And I think the more the Black Lives Matters protest and movement continues, you will hear some of these categories of slavery. So I want to be specific, right? I'm not talking about slavery in Greece 3,000 years ago. I'm not talking about slavery in the sense of if I capture someone in a war, then I enslave them in a prison camp. I'm not talking about that. When we're talking about the modern banking system of at least the last 70 years, we have to acknowledge as a realistic fact, right? Not as an opinion. We can have opinions about how we feel about it. And I think if you worked on Wall Street, you might have mixed feelings, right? You like making money. You like being able to buy materialist things like cars and houses and things like that, go on vacation. You might even feel good about yourself for donating, $500 to a cause. Uh, but if you're not acknowledging how that system started, then you're basically lying to yourself and others, right? So we have to understand that this kind of global order that we're presently in um, was built on the backs of Africans, 400 years ago. And so these aren't just great quotes, from folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and others, when they're making this fact known. It's a reality that we all need to kind of come to grips with, which is hard for people, right? It's not an easy thing to talk about race in America. Um, and so I think what I'm talking about here, right? We're not talking about race in this particular issue, but we have to start with that understanding that this is what the system is built on. And any basic American government class, if they're not talking about what is called intersectionality, the crossing point between race and poverty and gender, you should be very suspicious of why that is, right? Like, why does that teacher not acknowledge these facts? Why do they tell a different story when it's so obvious, right? When you think about the Civil War, when you think about the abolition movement, when you think about slaveholders in the South, when you think about slaveholders in the United States government, and when you think about what modern slavery looks like today, whether it's through the mass incarceration or whether it's through, stealing immigrants, essentially, as they're trying to make their way in the world. And I might just highlight, when you think about poverty, right, and slavery as a system, an overwhelming number of human beings right now who are being trafficked are coming from poor backgrounds and sold into sex slavery. And those are overwhelmingly young girls. And so you kind of should be able to see how this process works itself out over time and doesn't go away. It gets bigger, right? There's more people, there's more money, there's more ways of exchanging that money. And so I just want to kind of make sure that we understand that kind of basic. So I gave you a definition of the Atlantic slave genocide trade, however you want to call it. I personally would call it a genocide because it meets the definition of genocide according to the United Nations conventions. But if you look in a textbook, this is, or even a dictionary probably, you'll find this is the phrase that people are talking about. That goes back to like what you might call the roots of colonialism, right? When European countries, starting in Portugal, and then they all kind of competed with each other about stealing resources from other places, bringing them back, and then using that as a way of having a surplus that then established this system that we call capitalism today. So I realized, after teaching all these years at Kingsborough, that lots of students were never taught, that capitalism hasn't always been around, right? This is not the system that has always existed. In fact, it's very young as far as economic systems. Feudalism was over 1,000 years old. The Greeks had a kind of a different system. It was much smaller, but it was based more on reputation and more on a very fixed caste system. And so, capitalism is not quite a baby, right? It's kind of entering its like 11, 12-year-old stage. And in some ways, what people are starting to bend over backwards is, to call it socialist capitalism or advanced capitalism, or what one philosopher calls, what people are trying to say is capitalism with a happy face, right? Not wanting to deal with the consequences of capitalism as a system. And so what's interesting about that particular situation we're in now is that that was not the case at the founding of the country. There was a huge, almost violent arguments about whether there should be a banking system, about whether capitalism really should be in the United States, or whether we should do a different system based on a Roman model. And that was the Roman Republic. And so the idea was, you shouldn't let wealth leave the country. And that's what capitalism does, right? It takes money from the country and sends it somewhere else, which I think most folks know now is quote-unquote globalization. It's a simplistic way of thinking about it. But, the idea that a company like Apple, for example, can make billions of dollars in the United States in the 80s and 90s and then take it and store it in a bank in Ireland so that it doesn't have to pay taxes, is a pretty good example of the fears that folks like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had at the beginning of this debate, starting really in 1791. And then, maybe part of the story, I don't know, I've never seen the musical, but Alexander Hamilton, maybe, I don't know if they talked about this, but he was a fierce advocate for the bank, and was a fierce advocate for the circulation of money. And he had come from the Caribbean, where he saw this kind of slave trade going daily, and how one could make a lot of money, not just participating in the slave trade, directly, but, like essentially setting up a little food stop next to the slave trade block, right? So when people come and they purchase and sell slaves, hey, buy some food over here. So I think that's the harder part. What I'm trying to get folks, who are studying this to understand is that when we talk about this poverty system, we aren't just talking about, the obvious things, right? Say homelessness. We're talking about the people who benefit from homelessness, the people who benefit from a slave trade. Even if it doesn't seem like it, and especially if they don't know it, right? I assume they don't know. How many people would continue to do a job or a practice that they knew was harming other people? I don't think that's a large number. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it is a large number, but at least the people I've known, they usually do a job because they feel good about it, right? Or they have to, and I think that's where the danger lies. So the First National Bank, right, was hotly contested, and the fears of the people who are against the bank were true. They found out in about 10 years that it created federal debt. Right now we're at, $22 trillion and counting. It created money, which is a very complicated system that most people don't think about. But, it's not real. It's not an actual thing. It's not gold. It doesn't have any particular use, right? I'm not advocating burning money, but if you burned money, would anyone know? It's like the tree metaphor. And it established taxes, right? It established the taxation system, and then those taxes then got transferred over, and the bank that started out public became private within 10 years, and stocks came from that. So, the worst fears were it wasn't like worst fears happened over 200 years. It happened very quickly. And so that's just kind of the basic historical system that, I'm trying to get you to understand that we are now, stuck in a way. And lots of philosophers now say, it's very difficult. It's easier to imagine the end of the world, right? Whether that's the pandemic, right? Whether that's, Donald Trump's ideas of fake news, like whatever all these outlandish, just over the top, broad, sweeping generalizations. It's easier to imagine those things as being real than it is to end capitalism, right? And I think in the classroom, it's so easy to demonstrate this in like 10 minutes. And, people are in love with money and what they think it will accomplish for them. And they don't tend to think about the responsibilities, the debt, all the other kind of issues that come from it. So why this matters is that this is what this idea of private property is based on, right? Without this whole system, private property would be fairly meaningless. And you see it happened about 30 years before the start of this banking system. So, basically the idea that you could just kind of take something and it's yours, and then either a bank or a government or a social group will give you a piece of paper saying that's yours, that's really kind of what started this mess, if you think about it. And a lot of this is a rationalization of slavery, right? Because you have to have some reason that you can use, possess, enjoy, and then get rid of something. Because it's not, if you start to think about it in like, how does it benefit society? Well, obviously it doesn't. How is it useful to even a town? It's not, right? There's all these costs that nobody wanted to think about. And, one kind of artist living in Victorian England at the time, Oscar Wilde, made a joke. He was like, private property is like the worst thing in the world. You have to take care of it. There's constantly tax collectors. People want to come on to it. It's just like this thing never goes away. We'd be so much better off if we just got rid of it altogether. And the point being there is that was a possibility. It didn't have to be this way, right? So this is what we call in law is a legal fiction, right? There's no real such thing as private property, right? And the obvious point of that is like once you die, right? I mean, there's nothing you can do to protect it. Sure, you can write down in your will, you can write a piece of paper saying it's going to go somebody, but some of the funniest movies are all about family members and friends fighting over this piece of paper, right? So I think, the point here is just to kind of understand that this is really the right, or the law that has won out in the kind of competitive nature of America. And so by rights, what we mean is these two things. Like on the one hand, right, we mean these like core rights that you think about and you hear about all the time, right? Property, contracts, and then other ways of like kind of maintaining your power, the right to self-defense, right? That's meaningful to the person who has a semi-automatic rifle, the person who has a stick, right? What right to self-defense do they have in that relationship? Um, and then the fact that private rights, right, because you see rights then turn into private rights or rights to protect private property, then makes us individuals, right? So it says like you're an individual because you have a house. You're an individual because you have savings, right? You're an individual because you have this private thing. Obviously, you're not really an individual. That's not really a thing. You are a product of your parents at the very least, so that's three people already. And then of course they had parents, and so there's this is a complicated idea, but you're not really alone. You're not living in the middle of nowhere by yourself. So I think this is, and certainly like even if you were, the other 9 billion people on the planet are not. So you see the problem here is that we have learned to believe that rights are private, but they're not really private. And so the other side of this is that rights also are used by groups who don't have equal power, who don't have equal property, to challenge and try to say, I don't want to be exploited. I have the right to other things other than money, or the right to other things other than property, whether it be religion, whether it be family, happiness. I think comes up a lot in class. So I think what we want to think about is there's two sides to that coin, right? It's like a quarter. On one side, it's like, sure, there's obviously an established right, fiction, right, that we have a right to private property. But if you flip the coin around, right, there's also the right, that collective rights, that we have the right to come together, that we have the right to petition the government, we have the right to free speech as a group, right? So I think that's the idea I want you to start to think about as we move forward in the class. And then this should be obvious, but it leads to this idea of the humanities or humanitarian or the human rights framework. And what I'm talking about is that this became so obvious that we needed this, right? That if you just protect private property, you can lead to things like Nazism. And that was one of the main arguments of Nazism, is that I have the right to protect my property, and I have the right to expand my property, and therefore I have the right to defense. I can defend myself against anyone who would threaten my property, the expansion of my property, the resources I need to survive and flourish. And then that became an entire nation of ideas, right? A nation of individuals who were saying like, well, we have the right to define ourselves now, to exclude you, to kill you, right? To torture you. And so you can see how this can get carried away. And so largely since 1949, folks in the legal world have been trying to figure out like, how do you contain this problem of private property that gets just radical and so it's fundamental. And so one aspect that came out of this was like, well, how do you do this with also keeping what is called the wealth of the nations, right? And in my mind, this is like a bargain with the devil. You're trying to say, like, on the one hand, I know that money's evil. I know that this property-based system is terrible and it's causing all this problem, but I think I can solve it. And I can solve it if I can just redistribute. If I could just move, $10 from here to over here, then this will be okay. The problem is then you're always chasing money, as my friend says. And this all starts with this myth that there's a free market. I mean, it's amazing how in law we can just create these fictions all day, right? We can just make things up all day. I mean, what on earth is a free market? It also seems to be a contradiction in terms, right? Like, you have to pay for things in a market. Now, the idea was always that, well, the market will decide. Well, the market isn't a thing, right? People are things. So the people are the ones who go to the market and decide what they're going to pay. But okay, fine, you try that out. I want you to go to Amazon, find something you've always wanted, but you never had enough money to buy. And somewhere on the form, it's hard to find, but somewhere on there, find contact seller. and say, I know this thing is $500 or $1,000 or $10,000, but you know what? I'd like to give you $20 because after all, this is a free market, and so you should take whatever the buyer will give you, and see if they even respond to you, right? Because this is absurd, right? And then there's all sorts of rules. I think if you saw Donald Trump just in executive order, controlling the price of pharmaceuticals, right? There's the control of price of aeronautics, right? Of airplanes. There's all these controls by government, by banks, insurance carriers, work together. If you've ever wondered why, how come insurance rates are like the same in all these different places, it's because they work together. They establish the baseline of what they think it should cost. So the point being here is that, this system is a controlled system, and it's obviously controlled by people who have, the positions of power. And what's amazing to me is that very good people, right, people with a good heart, they believe in the human rights framework, then fall for this trap of, well, but we just need to redistribute the wealth. Well, no, right? Because you can't fix with your left hand what you're breaking with your right hand, right? So you need to stop breaking things in the first place, as CUNY professor Michelle Fine has said. So this is where I want you to start thinking, is that if you want to solve this problem of poverty, you are not going to be able to do it through money, through capitalism, right? Because the whole point of capitalism is to deprive people of their property and give it over to other people called capitalists. And property in that sense is what are you able to produce within your family, within your social group, and within a day, right? And so we are often working to give up our property to somebody else so that they can quote unquote monetize it, right? And we call that an investment, and a lot of poor people call it savings. But somebody else is making money off of your savings, you are not. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. But if you think about it this then from a educational point of view, if I learn more about law and banking, I'm not necessarily going to want to make more money. You might decide that that's what you want to do, and I have no judgment of you, right? You will do whatever you want to do. But at that point, you would no longer be looking at the injustice of poverty, right? You'd be looking at your own personal interest, and you'd be saying, I don't care about people who are poor. I think there is an idea, though, and especially, something I wrestle with on a regular basis, we'll talk about more in a different presentation, but at the same time, right, I'm not a martyr, and if I were to suddenly go poor, beyond the point of which I might have grown up, or at times, when I was in college and I had to make choices, right? Do I buy this book that the professor wants, or do I pay for, at one point I had to decide whether I paid for medical care, right? Do I pay for this bill that I have because I went to the hospital? I think that, there is this idea that since we're in this system, you do have to make that bargain with the devil, right? There's no sense in you dying as a public protest, starving yourself to death, especially at the age of 20, in order to try to change the system, because that single act alone isn't going to do it. So the idea is that you need to learn more about it, right? So if you're interested in poverty as an injustice, you have to learn more about the economic system. And so Bell Hooks really, who also taught at CUNY, really had this, I thought, really great point, right? And when she told her story about growing up and then going to college and just being, what is this crazy world I'm in all of a sudden? That made sense to me. That's how I felt as well. And so I learned the same way that she's saying here, right? Reading and writing was the thing that helped me better understand the economic system. It helped me better understand what was going on with law. It was showing me where law was failing as an ideal. And so that really is what led me to start thinking about, okay, how can I help other people? How can I think about injustice in a broader way beyond just myself? And I put in a student's poem that's been published, and this is only part of it. It was a very long poem. It's great. And this is their way of expressing themselves about what they had learned in class over the year, about how to defend themselves and, in their sense, about their community. And I thought this was a good example of what she's talking about, what Bell Hooks is talking about, is that, once folks are given the opportunity to learn and to express themselves, it's shocking in some ways, right, what folks are able to do. This was not an assigned thing. This was just an open thing, extra credit kind of idea. And this person obviously had a talent for poetry, and they decided that this was the way that they were going to, share it. And this has been, like I said, published in a national civic education journal, and so thousands of people have read this. And I think that's really the point. That's what revolutionary resistance looks like, right? We're not talking about burning up a building. What we're talking about is the idea of changing people's minds, of consciousness raising. But on the other hand, right, Bell Hooks is also saying, like, but if you don't get that, right, if you don't get that opportunity, if you don't get to go to community college, or you don't get to go to college at all, then you're probably, more concerned with money, right, and getting a job and all those things. But as this kind of map shows over here, it's not fair, right? Money is not fair. So you see, like, gross domestic product, right? That's what an area is able to produce financially through sales and services. So the darker areas are places in which large amounts of money are produced. The places where there's, like, no, right, it's like light and green. It's not shocking, right? Parts of the South, parts of the Midwest, where they're largely agrarian or they're largely farms. And I'm not talking about the big capitalist farms that you'll see on, like, a YouTube video. I'm talking about, like, family farms, right? People who are literally trying to live that idea of individualism, right? They believed in that myth, and they're trying to just get by raising their own food, maybe selling some of it at the market every week or something. They're barely getting by. And, so this is the reality that we're in, maybe two different realities here, right? One, on the one hand, you need access to education in order to learn about these things. But on the other hand, you might be living in one of those, yellowish white areas where there is no money, but you might believe you're rich. And so I think this is a big problem when we think about it from a knowledge point of view. So the main point I have for you here is just, these are like the main takeaways that I've learned over the years. So poverty is basic, right? We're not just talking about money. We're talking about the lack of social structure. So if I can't get health care, that's a sign of poverty. If I have no access to a retirement plan, right? There's just nothing for me when I turn a certain age and I'm no longer able to work in this capitalist environment. Nobody seems to care about me. That's a sign of poverty. And the sad part here is it's predictable, right? And not only is it predictable from those of us who are studying injustice, this is what bankers do. This is what investment bankers do. They know how many people are going to be poor. And this is how they make money, right? They call it leveraging. And so I think, like, this is the reality that we need to embrace. And especially when I was taking, like, business law classes and, learning about that side of the system, I want to say I was shocked, right? I mean, I was kind of shocked, like, at the cold-hearted, side of this, where folks are saying, well, it's just not my problem, those poor people, and then they have a bunch of rationalizations about why people are poor. Never was in my case. And one of the homeless advocates I'm working with presently, his name is Rob. He was poor. He was homeless for many years after he lost his job after the what was called the .com crash in 2001. He was educated. He had a job doing coding, and then just two bad things happened right in a row. He lost his job because the .com industry went bust, got laid off. And then he was in Florida, working for a company in Florida, and suddenly a hurricane hit. So suddenly he was, poor, evicted, and then on the streets, and then now comes a hurricane. So that obviously had huge problems, that he had to deal with all of a sudden. But there was no one to help him. There was no system there. And he was separated from his family after that, who lived in New York. And so he had no way. I mean, some people are probably so young, they're thinking, well, why didn't you just call using a cell phone? Well, sad to remind you, very few people had a cell phone in 2001. So this is the idea that, it's predictable and it's a result. This is a thing that governments think about all the time, right? People in government, they know how many people are going to have a hard time. You might have seen this and maybe not, if you weren't, interested in it. But go back and look at the reports back in March and April and even into May, about how they knew exactly how many people were going to be displaced, how they could tell you within, say 16 million people are likely not going to have a job because of COVID. So they're constantly thinking about this on the government side, but the banks are also thinking about it too, because they're thinking, well, how can we make sure that we're going to be able to make money or make profit in this system? And that's the sad reality. So you should be asking yourself in a way, right? Assuming you're following so far, like what I'm saying. Um, so how does this work? I mean, it seems so obvious that it's corrupt and that well, that's the point, right? In class, so many times students say, well, the system's corrupt. It's all about money. And they say that in a negative way. But then 5 minutes later, they say, yeah, but I want to make a lot of money. It's like, right. And this is called hegemony, right? This is the story. This is the narrative. And we see it in music, right? We see it in advertisements. Kim Kardashian is threatening to not use her Instagram, like, oh, give me a break. But this is the idea that, well, someday I'm going to be like her. It's like, well, okay, maybe. Unlikely, right? I mean, her dad was a wealthy lawyer, so, we can pretend like she did this all on her own, but that's not realistic. Same thing with Bill Gates. His dad was a wealthy lawyer. Zuckerberg went to Harvard. I mean, give me a break, right? These people are all born into a class of rich. You know, I think, like, this is the story that is attractive to hundreds of millions of people who, frankly, will never make more than $60,000 a year, which is plenty of money, unless you think that you're trying to be rich. And so, what people aren't understanding is it's a pyramid scheme. You can't be rich unless there's a bunch of people underneath you at the base that are not rich. That's how you get rich. You take their money, and that's what that whole game Monopoly is about. And what's sad right now is that lots of folks are telling themselves, "Well, I'm just going to save money. I'm going to put money in my savings." Well, fine, right? There's a 3.2% interest, or 3.2% inflation, right? Which means that basically every year a dollar is worth 3.2% less than it was last year. So it's constantly losing money, and this is how currency works, and this is what debt is. And so, unless your bank, which it's not, right? Your bank is probably giving you 1.7%. So you're losing 3.2 minus 1.7 every single year, which is compounded and which is divided into months. So if you put $200 into the bank, right, you're losing like $5, $10 every month on top of the fees that they're taking, whether they tell you they're taking it or not. But what's terrifying, I think, at the end of the day, is that they're using your money. They're making money. They're taking your money as collateral and investing it into another economic system. And that's why they want you to bring your money and put it into a savings account. Now, on the other side of things, right, I would say from a poor person's perspective, the reason why we save money is not necessarily to become rich. What we do is we're scared, and I think rightly scared, that if something bad were to happen, this is the rainy day fund. But listen to that logic, and I agree with you. I use it for a rainy day fund. I'm not using it to get interest. But lots of folks convince themselves that they are getting interest when it's just a fact, an economic fact, that they are not. So I think this is the big kind of debate when you start thinking about universal health care, right? The idea that you shouldn't have to pay for health care, right? And then the idea of some kind of universal basic income, that you shouldn't have to have a rainy day fund to pay for prescriptions for cancer, right? You shouldn't have to have a rainy day fund to pay for a backpack for a kid to go to school, although that, right, at this exact moment, precisely, that doesn't work. But you understand the point here is that a social system shouldn't force individuals to give over half their money just to have a rainy day fund. And so in some ways, when people say, well, what about the people who put, this happens in class, right? What about the people who put money underneath their mattress? Well, they're still losing 3.2% every month, right? So the only benefit you get from putting your income into a bank is that instead of losing 3.2, you're losing 1.7, right? So that's the idea. And you should think about that math, right? I mean, the bank still wants to make sure it gets 0.1 more than you do. So the big idea is that this is necessary in order to keep the dollar circulating. And probably, this is where, if you're really super interested in, say, foreign policy or international relations, this is what China is trying to manipulate. They're trying to take advantage of this, especially with cyber currency. And so it will be interesting to see how long this hegemony goes on as people start to question these unfair practices. So basically, lacking alternative wealth and political structures, the poor are warehoused and used as a surplus labor force. And think of Amazon, Costco, whatever, right? Poor people are just kind of like put into a big box, and capitalists wait until the crisis occurs, and then they start arguing for retraining, don't worry, I'll give you a 32% interest loan. You'll get out of this. I'll give you a micro loan, right? $500, and then I'll give you another micro loan. So it's like uh, gambling in a way. Um, or I'll put you in prison, right? I'll invent some new crimes. Right now apparently it's okay to sell marijuana, but 15 years ago, if you were to be caught in possession of a single joint, you'd go to jail. Meanwhile, while you're there, we're going to put you to work. We're not going to pay you, and then the state's going to make money off that. I mean, I think it was shameful when Governor Cuomo was advocating and selling products that were being made by prisoners for hand sanitizer. I mean, what a useless activity. But you see that even folks who say that they're pro-democrat, right, liberal, they buy into this hegemony, right? They're going to save money by having prisoners make it, and even prisoners are on the cause. Meanwhile, many prisoners were getting corona in the prison. So I think this is what I mean by lacking alternatives, right? There's what else can we do, right? Where else should we put our money? And at one point, you could start a competitive bank. I think that's probably impossible at this point. So it's just something to think about. Try not to dwell on it, but just to think about this is a certain percentage of the population has to be unemployed in order to keep capitalism going. So this violation of human rights does not appear at first, right, as bad as, say, the Holocaust. And I agree, right? In some ways, it's not. But it is staggering, right? I mean, it's not a small thing. But because when you start listing, like, what are all the things that happen because of poverty? And notice that when people are studying cancer, they look at, like, well, what did you eat? Or did you exercise enough? Or, all these, and they don't think about, well, where do you live, right? Is there asbestos all around you? Have you been to the doctor regularly? I mean, things that poor people really don't have time to think about, right? You're just trying to get through the day. And so getting these illnesses, diabetes, all these things are tied to poverty, right? So what is the cause of these things? Poverty. Wealthy people have ways of paying for medical care, whereas poor people don't. Violence is almost obvious when you take your criminology classes, right? Poor people are obviously more likely to commit crimes of various kinds. First of all, they're not the ones who get to decide what a crime is, right? Nobody's allowing poor people to say, well, what do you think crime should be? I think we'd probably define crime very differently than the way that wealthy people would. Addiction, it's been shown over and over and over again that addiction is linked to poverty. And so, when you start looking at the list, we're talking about billions of people in the world who suffer from poverty. And it's been well established, right? And I don't even need to really go over this again, but it's so well known. There's so many people who know that this system is all built on that Atlantic slave trade and the global racial capitalist order. And it's just, swept under the rug or ignored or explained away. Or at the end of the day, right, the famous New York saying, it is what it is, nothing can be done. Well, no, right, because it didn't exist forever. People made it this way. People have lost their lives trying to fight against it. So I think, just to try to think about it is like, we know very well, but we're still struggling to figure out what to do as an alternative. So I just wanted to kind of like end with this idea. Well, law does not have to be wed to this, right? Law, in fact, most of the time, something called natural law has over and over and over again for thousands of years called out, right? Said, no, there's a disconnect between what law is and what slavery is, and you don't need credit-based economies. You don't need to go into debt, circulate capital, and exploit people in order to take care of other people. And in fact, it's a contradiction to even try to do that. And it's been a violation of rights, not just in this country, but all around the world for thousands of years. And some of the most notable legal theorists have brought this up. But on the other side of this is something called positivism, which started up in about the 1890s, getting more popular. And then by the time it got to the 1930s, when the Great Depression occurred, this was kind of the main way that people were thinking about these problems. And this is the redistribution of wealth idea in the economic approach. And what's strange is that they're in two groups. And one's property interests, those are Republicans, and then the other one is liberal interests, which are Democrats. But the point here is not so much that these are like, okay, those are only options in politics apparently in the United States, which is becoming less so with Bernie Sanders, AOC, and even the far right wingers don't seem to fit into these groups cleanly anymore. But the point here is they represent only 40% or less of the American population. So 60% of us are not represented by these two groups. We don't believe, we don't agree with these people, and yet they're the ones who are making all of these rules. So that's not law, right? That's a gang. And so the idea that they have now started using this language of law and order for the last 60 years is interesting, right? It would be like a gang going around saying, no, what we're doing is actually illegal. And, I'm not advocating for that, but that would probably work, right? If a gang went around for long enough saying that what they're doing is actually illegal, I think people would start to say, well, maybe they're right. Especially if they started giving you like a check every 10 years. So I think you just need to keep this in mind again, that poverty is a system. It is not the result of an individual choice. Although we can think of all individuals who make bad choices, right? But it's very rare that wealthy people make a bad choice in the same way that a poor person makes a bad choice and then they don't have any consequences for it. So I think like that the point of individualism is the problem there. Because it's like saying the game is rigged, you made the wrong choice in the game, so therefore you're to blame. It's like, well, no, I'd like to play a different game. So I just want to end with just a provoking thought, right? Because this was from Thomas Jefferson, a very contradictory, problematic figure. But when folks say that, like, no, capitalism is American, blah, 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 well, that doesn't seem to really match reality, right? Very few Americans in the 1770s were for capitalism, were for banking. And so I think a quote like this proves the point. Some people were, right? Just like some people were for slavery, like Thomas Jefferson, and other people, like John Adams, were not. So it's never quite that simple. So you need to think about it as a complicated system. And I'll go into a little bit more of my personal history in a different presentation. But I hope this was helpful, at least just giving you a big, broad picture.